The chamber smelled like 100 different worlds. Every species that sat inside the Grand Galactic Council Hall brought something with them. The thick sulfur mist that the Vrethkai needed to breathe. The low electromagnetic hum that kept the silicon-based Dunari comfortable. The faint bioluminescent glow pulsing from the Alhari delegation in the far corner. It was a room built to hold the galaxy's greatest minds. Today, it was also a room full of something else entirely, laughter. The source of that laughter was a single, holographic display floating above the center of the hall. On it played footage of human soldiers. Not fighting, not charging, not standing tall with weapons raised. The footage showed them retreating, pulling back in organized lines, carrying their wounded, covering their escape with smoke and confusion, then vanishing into terrain like they had never existed at all. The Vrethkai ambassador, a towering creature with 4 arms and a jaw, built to crush stone, leaned toward his aide and said something in his native tongue. The translation came a half-second later through the universal feed. "They run like prey animals," he said. The laughter in the chamber grew louder. Commander Yara Solis stood at the human delegation's podium and did not flinch. She was a short woman by human standards, with dark eyes and a jaw set, so firm it could have been carved from the same rock as the council's ancient walls. Behind her stood 2 other human officers, equally still, equally quiet. None of them looked embarrassed. None of them looked angry. They simply waited. The footage was real. She had seen it herself. 6 weeks ago, the human expeditionary force on the border, moon of Cassil 7, had been outnumbered 4-1 by the Drath Collective's advance army. The Drath were enormous. Each soldier stood nearly 3 meters tall, their bodies wrapped in dense natural armor that made conventional weapons mostly useless. A direct confrontation would have been suicide. So the humans had done what the humans always did. They had not fought. Not yet. They had retreated, tactically, deliberately. And the Council had recorded every second of it. Grand Arbiter Sho Lenneth, the ancient and deeply respected leader of the Council session, raised one of his 6 fingers, and the laughter faded, mostly. He addressed Commander Solis with the polite but unmistakable tone of someone who had already made up their mind. "Commander, the Council has reviewed the engagement at Cassil 7. We note with some concern that your forces abandoned the defensive perimeter entirely. The Drath advanced unopposed. Your soldiers, how should I put this, fled? They withdrew," Solis said. "The result appears identical," said the Alhuri representative, their bioluminescent patches flickering in what her translator told her was amusement. Solis did not correct them again. "Instead," she said, "we would like to request Council support for a counter-engagement at Cassil 7. We believe the Drath Collective intends to use that moon as a staging ground for strikes deeper into the neutral corridor. If that happens, it is not just a human problem." The room murmured. The neutral corridor was exactly that, neutral. It protected dozens of smaller species from the bigger ones. If the Drath used Cassil 7 to punch through it, the consequences would ripple across 40 inhabited systems. But the Vrethkai ambassador was not done making his point. He stood fully, all 4 arms spread slightly, in the gesture his species used when dismissing something beneath their consideration. "Commander Solis, the Vrethkai have fought the Drath before. We stood our ground. We bled for every meter. We did not run." He let that land for a moment. "Humanity has been a council member for less than 30 years. You are young. You are small. Perhaps your instinct for self-preservation is simply stronger than your courage." The word he used did not translate perfectly, but the feed did its best. The closest human equivalent was coward. The chamber waited to see how Solis would respond. Some of the smaller delegations, the ones who had no love for Vrethkai arrogance, leaned forward. The Dunari, who communicated entirely through pattern and vibration, shifted in a way that Solus's aide recognized as heightened attention. Solus turned slightly and nodded to the officer behind her. He stepped forward and placed a data chip on the podium. The central display changed. The footage of the retreat disappeared. What replaced it was a map, Cassiel 7 and the surrounding space, covered in layered tactical markers. The Drath advanced, Solus said. We know. We let them. She touched the map and zoomed into the moon's surface. This is where they are now. 60,000 soldiers. Their supply lines run through 3 narrow corridors because of the terrain. Their communications are being disrupted by the magnetic anomalies in the moon's northern shelf. Anomalies we identified 4 months ago and chose this position specifically. Because of... She looked up at the Vrethkai ambassador. They are not pursuing us. They believe we ran. They are comfortable. They are setting up infrastructure. They are not watching the sky the way they would if they thought we were coming back. Silence. We did not retreat because we were afraid, Solus continued. And her voice carried no heat, no defensiveness. Just the flat calm of someone reading a weather report. We retreated because 60,000 Drath in open ground, at full readiness, with supply lines intact, would cost us more than any moon is worth. 60,000 Drath who think they've already won, who are tired, extended. Building supply depots instead of watching their flanks, that is a different problem entirely. The Alhari representatives' bioluminescent patches shifted color. The Dunari pattern changed again. The Vrethkai ambassador lowered 1 pair of arms, not all 4, but 1 pair, which those who knew his species understood as a meaningful concession. Grand. Arbiter Sholenneth looked at the map for a long moment. Then he looked at Commander Solus. You are saying the retreat was the strategy. I am saying the retreat was the first move, Solus replied. Another silence. Longer this time. The Vrethkai ambassador sat back down. Sh Olenneth folded 2 of his hands together in the council's formal gesture of continued session. You have the floor, Commander. Tell us what the second move looks like. Solus nodded once. The map zoomed out. New lines appeared, approach vectors, timing windows, a dozen small symbols that represented assets already in motion, already in place, already waiting. She had not come to the council to ask for permission. She had come to tell them what was about to happen, and to give them the chance to be part of it rather than be surprised by it. It starts in 72 hours, she said. In the front row of the observation gallery above the main floor. A young Alhari intern, who had been recording the session for the council archives, leaned over to his supervisor and asked a quiet question. He had studied humanity in his academic training. He knew their history, their wars, their art, their long and bloody road from one small world to the stars. But he had never seen a human in a room like this before. Are they always like that? He asked, so calm when others laugh at them? His supervisor, who was 300 years older and had watched humanity's first clumsy steps into galactic politics from this very gallery, considered the question seriously. No, she said. Not always calm, but always patient. She watched Commander Solus move through the map with quiet precision, every gesture deliberate, every number memorized, every variable already accounted for. They are a species that learned very early that the loudest moment in a fight is not the most important one. They come from a world where half the things that could kill them were things they never saw coming. She paused. They learned to think further ahead than the pain in front of them. It made them strange among predators, and it made them something else entirely in a war. The intern watched the commander. What? The supervisor did not hesitate. Dangerous, she said. 72 hours felt like nothing and everything at the same time. On the surface of Cassiel 7, the Drath had been busy. They were not a species that rested easily. Their biology demanded constant activity, their culture demanded visible progress, and their commanders demanded results that could be reported back to the collective central command in the form of numbers. Meters held, structures built, resources extracted. In the 6 weeks since their advance across the moon's northern flatlands, they had erected 3 forward command posts, laid the foundation for a permanent garrison, and begun drilling into the moon's subsurface for the rare isotopes that made Cassil-7 worth fighting. Over in the first place, they had also stopped thinking about the humans. This was not carelessness on the part of any individual draft soldier. It was something more systematic, a collective assumption built from everything the draft knew about their opponents. The humans had run. The draft had followed their doctrine, which stated clearly that a retreating enemy was a defeated enemy. There was no tactical framework in the draft military tradition for an enemy who retreated on purpose. The concept did not exist in their vocabulary. You fought until you won or you died. That was the nature of war. An enemy who chose to flee instead of dying in place was an enemy who had accepted defeat. The draft had centuries of history behind that belief, and it had served them extraordinarily well against every species they had ever faced. It would not serve them today. 12,000 kilometers above Cassil-7's northern pole, in the shadow of the moon's small debris ring, where sensors were notoriously unreliable, 3 human vessels sat in perfect silence. They had been there for 11 days. The crews had maintained strict emissions discipline. No active scans, no unnecessary power draws, no communications except tightly beamed low-energy pulses aimed away from the planet and bounced off a relay satellite, so small and so dark that the draft had never detected it. The ships were called the Ardent, the Pale Meridian, and the Tessara. They were not warships in the traditional sense. They were something the human fleet called a disruption wing, fast, light, built to break things rather than fight things. Their weapons were mostly electronic. Their real payload was information and timing. Commander Solis was aboard the Ardent. She had not slept more than 4 hours in the last 3 days, but she did not look tired in any way that mattered. She stood at the tactical display in the ship's operations center and went over the plan one final time with her 3 lead officers. Not because any of them needed to hear it again, but because saying a thing aloud before executing it was a habit she had developed over 20 years of doing this. And habits like that kept people alive. The draft have 3 command posts, she said. Command Post Alpha is here, in the old crater basin. That's their comms hub. Beta is the logistics center on the ridge. Gamma is the deep drill site, which is also where their senior command staff is located. She touched each point on the map. We are not attacking any of them directly. Lieutenant Daraven, young, brilliant, with the kind of focused intensity that reminded Solis uncomfortably of herself at that age, frowned at the map. Then what are we hitting? The spaces between them, Solis said. She explained it simply, because simple was the only thing that held up under pressure. The draft's 3 command posts were strong individually, but they depended on each other. Alpha handled communications for all 3. Beta kept all 3 fed and supplied. Gamma held all the decision-making authority. Cut the links between them, and each post became an island, still fortified, still armed, still full of large, angry soldiers, but confused, slow to react, and unable to coordinate. A draft soldier who knew exactly what to do was terrifying. A draft soldier who was waiting for orders that weren't coming was a very different problem. The Disruption Wing's job was to cut those links. The electronic payloads aboard the Ardent would target Alpha's communication arrays. A small strike team, 8 humans in light exosuits, carried down in a drop pod so quiet and so fast that the drafts Atmospheric sensors would register it as a debris fragment, would sever the physical supply lines, running to Beta, and the Tessara would park, itself directly above Gamma, can begin broadcasting. On every frequency the Drath used, filling their coms with noise, false orders, and carefully constructed confusion. Dath Ven looked at the plan for a long moment. And then? Then we wait again, Solace said. Ven stared at her. We wait. Chaos has a shape, Solace told him. You can predict it if you understand what the other side does when they don't know what to do. The Drath, when communications fail, default to one behavior. They consolidate. They pull inward. Every subunit starts moving toward the nearest command post to report and receive physical orders. She tapped the map, which means 60,000 soldiers are going to start moving along predictable routes. And we will know exactly where they're going before they do. Below that explanation, unspoken but understood by everyone in the room, was the second half of the plan. The part that was not the disruption, Wing's job at all. Because the humans were not doing this alone. The Council had listened to Commander Solace's briefing. They had watched her map. 3 of the smaller species, the Tunai, the Rethali, and the Cascade Worlds Compact, had committed forces the moment she finished speaking. Not out of loyalty to humanity. Out of self-interest in the neutral corridor. The Vrethkai had committed nothing, predictably. But the Alheri, who moved slowly and carefully and almost never committed to anything military, had sent a message 2 days after the council session. Short, no ceremony. It contained fleet coordinates and a single line of text that translated roughly as, "We will be in position." That mattered more than anything else. The Alhari fleet was not large. It was not built for direct confrontation. But it operated on principles of speed and precision that no other species in the Council had ever fully matched. And it was positioned now at the moon's southern approach, the direction the Drath's resupply convoys came from. When the chaos on the surface began, those convoys would be cut off too. The Drath on Cassiel 7 would be fighting blind, confused, and hungry, with no reinforcements coming and no way to call for them. Solace looked at her officers. They looked back at her. None of them smiled. It was too early for that. But there was something in the room that felt very much like readiness. "Launch window opens in 40 minutes, she said. Everyone knows their role. We execute clean, and we execute quiet for as long as quiet as possible. When it stops being quiet, she looked at Ven. We adapt." Ven gave a short nod. The other officers moved. The operations center filled with the low sound of preparation, systems warming up, teams checking in, the deep mechanical patience of a plan finally moving from thought into reality. Down on Cassiel 7's surface, a Drath patrol finished its circuit of the northern perimeter and returned to Alpha Command Post to log its report. Nothing unusual. No contacts. No signals. The humans were gone, had been gone for weeks, and showed no sign of returning. The patrol commander noted this in the log with satisfaction and went to eat dot above him. In the dark between the stars, 8 humans in near-invisible exosuits were already falling. They hit the upper atmosphere at a shallow angle, bleeding speed over a long arc to stay below thermal detection thresholds. And the drop pod burned dark the entire way down. No retro thrusters, no active guidance. Just a precisely calculated ballistic fall that had been worked out to the last decimal point by a woman 11 days ago, sitting in the dark above a debris ring, running numbers over and over until she was certain. The pod touched down in a dry riverbed 2 kilometers east of Beta Command Post. The 8 soldiers were out and moving before the dust settled. They had a 40-minute window before the launch phase began. They needed 30-7. Nobody on the surface heard them coming. Nobody on the surface saw them land. That was not luck. That was not accident. That was 6 weeks of preparation, 11 days of silence, 72 hours of a council chamber being allowed to laugh, and a commander who had understood something about war that the Vrethkai, ambassador, for all his bluster, had not. Patience was not cowardice. Restraint was not weakness. And an enemy who thought they had already. Juan was not prepared for what came next. The clock hit 0. The Arden's first electronic payload fired across Castle 7. Every Drath communication system went dark. And the second move began. Silence to a Drath soldier was the worst possible thing. Not because they feared quiet in the way that some species did, not because the dark made them anxious or the stillness made them nervous. No, the Drath feared silence the way a machine feared losing power. Their entire military structure ran on communication. Constant, layered, redundant communication. Every unit reported to a sub-commander. Every sub-commander reported to a sector lead. Every sector lead reported to one of the 3 command posts. The chain never stopped. It was not just doctrine. It was reflex. Drath soldiers who could not communicate with their chain of command were, by their own training, effectively non-functional. They could fight. They could certainly still fight. But they could not coordinate, could not react with the collective precision that made Drath armies so brutally effective. And most critically, they could not adapt. So when every unit in every Drath position on Castle 7 went to static at the same moment, the initial reaction was not panic. It was confusion, then irritation. Then the slow, grinding machinery of Drath doctrine began to engage. And 60,000 soldiers started doing the only thing there training told them to do when command went. Silent, they moved toward the nearest command post. Commander. Solis watched the movement patterns develop on her. Tactical display in real time. Fed through the Arden's passive sensor array. She had predicted 3 consolidation routes. There were 4. She noted the deviation, cross-referenced it with the terrain mapping her team had built during their 11 days of silence, and adjusted 2 secondary timings without changing the core plan. The 4th route funneled directly past a terrain feature her strike teams had already seeded with disruption charges. She sent a 2-word message to her ground team. Route 4, 2 words. They understood. On the surface, Sergeant Priya Okafor, lead of the 8-person infiltration unit, received the message on a hardline relay she was crouching beside in the dry riverbed. She relayed it to her team with a hand signal. No words, no noise. The team was 300 meters from Beta Command Post's external supply junction, and Drath soldiers from the surrounding units were already filtering past on their way inward. The humans did not move. They breathed slowly and stayed flat against the shadow side of a rocky outcrop and let 200 large, confused, heavily armored soldiers walk past within shouting distance. This was the part that people who had never done it could not fully understand. It was not bravery in the traditional sense, not the rushing forward kind, not the standing firm while things explode kind. It was a different quality entirely. It was the ability to remain completely still, completely quiet, and completely calm while everything around you was dangerous, and to do it not out of paralysis, but out of choice, out of plan, out of the absolute conviction that this moment of stillness was exactly where you were supposed to be, and that moving would be the wrong decision. The Drath patrol passed. Another followed. Okafor's team waited. Then the route opened. They moved. 37 meters to the supply junction's access panel, covered in under a minute using the shadow cast by a power relay tower. The junction itself was a physical network node, thick bundles of conduit connecting Beta's logistics systems to the other 2 command posts. Cutting it would not just stop supplies. It would trigger Beta's automated diagnostic systems. which would flood what was left of the internal draft network with priority 1 alerts. Adding noise on top of the noise the Ardent was already broadcasting. The confusion would compound. Exponentially. Private Keshu, the team's technical specialist, had the panel open in 40 seconds. He had practiced this exact panel design 419 times in the weeks before the mission. Because someone had captured a draft logistics schematic 8 months ago, and Solus had distributed it to every technical specialist in the expeditionary force with a note that simply read, "Know this." He knew this. His hands moved without hesitation. The conduit bundles came apart in sequence. No sparks. Clean cuts, correctly sequenced to avoid the feedback loops that would have triggered an immediate local alarm. The junction went dark. Somewhere inside Beta Command Post, a draft logistics officer stared at a board full of error codes and began shouting. Okafor and her team were already moving back to the riverbed. Above the surface. The Tessara took her position over Gamma Command Post and opened every broadcast array she carried. What came out of those arrays was not random noise. The Tessara's signal specialists had spent weeks building it, a carefully layered composite of draft command frequencies, formatted to sound like genuine priority transmissions from 3 different command authorities, each one contradicting the others. Ordering units north, ordering units south, declaring the situation under control, declaring an emergency, authorizing use of heavy weapons, countermanding authorization for heavy weapons. All of it in perfect draft military communication format, indistinguishable from genuine orders, except for the fact that it was coming from, everywhere at once, and contradicting itself completely, a draft soldier, receiving conflicting orders from multiple apparent command authorities entered what their training defined as a resolution state. Pause in action while the chain of command sorted out the contradiction. In normal circumstances, that pause lasted seconds. With the physical comes down and the broadcast noise filling every channel, the resolution state had no resolution. It just continued, and continued, and the longer it continued, the more units stopped moving and waited for clarity that was never going to come. 60,000 soldiers, and a growing number of them were simply standing still. This was the window. Solus had been watching for it, not a specific moment, but a specific shape in the data. A pattern in the movement feeds that told her the consolidation had peaked, and the hesitation was spreading faster than the consolidation. When the ratio crossed the threshold she had calculated, she keyed her command channel and said 2 words to the waiting fleet above. Cassil 7, all elements. The Alhari fleet came out of the southern approach at full speed. It did not slow down. Alhari ships were narrow and fast and built around a propulsion principle that humans had taken 40 years to partially understand and still could not fully replicate. Something about folded momentum, about storing energy in geometries that physics was supposed to prevent. What it meant practically was that a small Alhari strike fleet could cross the distance between jump emergence and orbit in the time it took most species to finish acquiring targets. They were inside the Drath resupply convoy's formation before the convoy's escort. Ships registered them as threats. The convoy escort was destroyed in under 4 minutes. The resupply ships, carrying enough food, munitions, and replacement parts to sustain 60,000 draft soldiers for 3 months, were disabled and seized, not destroyed. Solus had been very specific about this. Destroying them was wasteful and also would take longer. Disabled and seized meant that the cargo was now available for use by anyone who needed it. It also meant that the crews were alive, which was a humanitarian consideration that the Drath found bizarre, and the Tunai delegation, watching the feed from their observation ship, found remarkable. The Rethali and Cascade Worlds compact forces had taken the northern approach, blocking the only other resupply corridor. They did not have the elegance of the Alhari. They made up for it with sheer mass. The Rethali flew ships that were, by most standards, offensively large, and they used them the way you would expect. The northern corridor was simply gone, blocked by things too big to move quickly and too well armed to engage without serious cost. Castle 7 was now an island. Solace allowed herself a moment to look at the full picture on the tactical display. All the moving parts, the Disruption Wing's electronic assault, Okafor's ground team, the Tessera's broadcast, the Alhari Southern Strike, the Rethali Northern Block, all of it running simultaneously, all of it landing within the timing window she had built for it. Not perfectly. Never perfectly. The fourth consolidation route had been unexpected. The Tessera had taken a glancing hit from a Drath point defense gun that its commander had apparently fired on reflex rather than order. One of Okafor's team had twisted an ankle in the dark and was moving slower than planned, but in the shape that mattered, the large shape, the strategic shape. It was holding exactly as designed. Lieutenant Ven appeared at her shoulder and looked at the display. He was quiet for a moment. They still have 60,000 soldiers, he said. On the ground, armed. Yes, Solace agreed. So what happens now? Solace pulled up a new channel on the command board. Now we tell them what happened, she said. We give them an accurate picture of their situation. Supply lines cut. Comms compromised. No reinforcements coming. Options clearly laid out. She looked at Ven. Most of them are going to stand down. Ven stared at her. You think the Drath will surrender? Not all of them, she said, without any particular emotion. But enough. She paused. They're not irrational. They're just rigid. Give them a rigid structure that says, this situation is unwinnable, and standing down is the correct response, and a significant number of Drath commanders will follow it. Because that's what their training tells them to do when the math is clear. She keyed the channel. Across 60,000 Drath communicators, the purse. It took 6 hours. Not for a fight, for a surrender. The distinction mattered enormously, and Commander Solace had been very careful about the language she used in every communication that followed the initial broadcast. Because language, she had learned, was itself a tool. And like any tool, it could do precise work or clumsy work, depending on how you held it. She did not use the word surrender once. She used the phrase tactical disengagement. She used operational cessation. She framed it in the Drav's own military terminology, using the formal structures their command manuals prescribed for situations where continued engagement would result in unnecessary losses with no strategic gain. She gave them a framework their culture could process. She gave their commanders the ability to say, truthfully, that they had done the mathematically correct thing, that their decision was not defeat, but optimization. It worked. Not completely. There were holdouts, 3 subsectors of Drath forces, totaling roughly 8,000 soldiers, who rejected the broadcast, rejected the terms, and began consolidating at their nearest command posts with clearly hostile intent. Solis had expected between 2 and 4 non-compliant subsectors, so 3 was within the model. She had assets ready for those 3. She did not send in soldiers. She sent in noise, more broadcast confusion specifically targeted at those sectors. Combined with a narrow beam, geological disruption pulse from the pale meridian that caused a localized tremor along the ridge near Beta Command Post, collapsing an access tunnel and cutting off the largest of the 3 holdout concentrations from the others, isolated, confused, cut off from each other, still dangerous, but contained. The remaining 52,000 Drath soldiers formally acknowledged the disengagement terms at the 14-hour mark, when their senior command staff at Gamma Post, who had spent the entire operation in a communications blackout and had only received the situation summary 2 hours prior, issued an order to their field commanders that, translated roughly as, "The MAF has spoken. Stand down." They stood down. By the time a council observation shuttle arrived at Cassil 7, the draft forces were in organized positions, weapons flagged as non-active, waiting for the logistical process of formal separation to begin. The 3 holdout sectors had been contained, still not compliant, but not fighting, not advancing, simply stuck in a very uncomfortable situation with no good options and declining morale. Solace had people talking to them, directly, small teams with translators and no weapons, crouching just outside weapons range and speaking through amplifiers in that same measured, formal draft register, patient, repeating the math, again and again. 2 of the 3 holdout sectors stood down on day 2. The 3rd took until day 4. When their food ran out, a council observation shuttle landed near the human forward position, a modest setup. A few prefabricated shelters and a tactical station, nothing dramatic. No victory decorations, no banners. Commander Solis met the council observers at the landing ramp in the same clothes she had been wearing for the past 4 days, which were dusty and functional and contained no visible concession to ceremony. This detail made it into the official council report, noted with some puzzlement by the officer who wrote it. The observation team was led by a senior council attached named Vethsori, a methodical Ilhari woman with the calm, light-collecting eyes of her species and a reputation for writing reports that were so precise they sometimes felt surgical. She had witnessed 3 major interspecies conflicts in her career, and she had written about all of them. She was not easy to impress. She looked at the scene, the standing down draft, the human forward position, the complete absence of large-scale destruction, the remarkably low casualty counts on all sides, and she was quiet for a long time. Then she said to Commander Solis, "You designed this to minimize draft casualties." It was not a question. "Yes," Solis said. "Why?" Vethsori asked, not challenging, genuinely curious. It was the question she had come here to answer, and she wanted to hear it from the source. Solis thought about how to explain it and settled on the truth, which was also the simplest version. "Because we're going to have to share this part of the galaxy with the draft for the next several thousand years," she said. "Every soldier we kill today is a grievance that outlives this moon. Every soldier who walks away from this with their life, especially one who walks away with a version of this story, that says the outcome was strategically correct rather than humiliating, is one less recruitment poster for the next generation of Drath who want to come back and finish it." Vethsori was quiet again. "The Vrethkai," she said carefully, "when they fought the Drath 20 years ago, killed approximately 400,000 soldiers in a 3-week campaign." "I know," Solis said. "They won decisively." "They won that campaign," Solis agreed. "The Drath have attempted 6 retaliatory strikes against Vrethkai territory since then. That's also in the record." Vethsori looked at her for a long moment. "You are making an argument about time horizons," she said. "Most species, when they win a battle, are thinking about the battle. We've been at war with ourselves and with each other for a long time," Solis said simply. "Long enough to have records. Long enough to see what happens after. We think about the battle, but we also think about what comes after the battle, and after that, and what the situation looks like in 20 years when the people who remember why they were supposed to hate each other have all gotten older, and the ones who come after them have to decide from scratch whether the hating was worth it." It was the most she had said to anyone about philosophy in years. She did not consider herself a philosopher, But the question had been asked directly, and it deserved a direct answer. Vethsori made a note on her recording device. Then she looked up. "The Grand Arbiter will want a full briefing," she said, "particularly regarding the coordination with the Alheri fleet." That was unexpected by most of the Council. "I know," Solis said. "I'll be there." The Alheri, for their part, had already sent a message to the Council. It was characteristically brief. It said only that the engagement at Cassiel 7 had confirmed that human strategic methodology was worth study, and that the Alheri were prepared to discuss future coordination in more detail at the Council's convenience. Coming from the Alhari, this was the rough equivalent of a standing ovation back in the Grand Council Hall. The session that convened 2 weeks after the engagement was very different in atmosphere from the one before it. Not because the Council had become suddenly warm toward humanity. The Vrethkai ambassador was still present, still imposing, still deeply reluctant to acknowledge anything that complicated his preferred understanding of war. But the room was different in a way that was hard to articulate, and easy to feel when Commander Solis walked to the podium this time. Nobody laughed. The Vrethkai ambassador sat with all 4 arms in the formal neutral position, not spread in dismissal, not raised in challenge, neutral, which for a Vrethkai in this context was a very deliberate thing. Solis presented the after-action summary. Casualty figures. Strategic outcomes. The status of the neutral corridor, which remained intact. The terms of the draft disengagement, which included a 6-year withdrawal from the Cassiel region that had already been verified by independent monitors. She spoke for 22 minutes, and the room was completely quiet throughout. At the end, Grand Arbiter Sholenneth asked one question. "Commander Solis, at the previous session, a member of this council used a specific word to describe humanity's forces. A word that I believe translates in your language as coward." He paused. "Do you wish to respond to that characterization now?" Solis looked at the Vrethkai ambassador. He looked back at her. His expression, insofar as a species without human-style facial musculature had an expression, was entirely unreadable. "No," Solis said. A murmur went around the chamber. "No?" Sholenneth repeated. "The result speaks for itself," Solis said. "And the result is documented in the council record. Anyone who wants to understand what happened at Cassiel 7 can read it. I don't need to add anything to it." She stepped away from the podium in the observation gallery. The young Alheri intern who had been there for the first session was back. He had specifically requested assignment to this session when he found out Solis would be presenting. He had been thinking about what his supervisor had said since the first day, about patience and about danger, and about a species that had learned to think further ahead than the pain in front of them. Watching, Commander Solis walked calmly back to her seat. In a room that had laughed at her people 2 weeks ago and was now completely silent, he thought he understood it a little better. The Drath had understood war as a thing. That happened until someone was dead or defeated. The Vrethkai had understood war as a matter of pride, of standing firm, of bleeding visibly, of being seen to absorb punishment without flinching. These were not wrong understandings, exactly. They had produced effective warriors by their own definitions. But the humans understood war as a problem to be solved. And when you approached it that way, when you stripped away the pride and the spectacle and the need to be seen fighting, and you looked only at the problem and what solved it most completely at the lowest cost, you ended up with something that looked, from certain angles, like cowardice, and from every O,